Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. Distress signal.
It all started with a simple trip. Emily and I had been talking about it for months. A getaway to an isolated island off the coast of Maine. We were both in need of a break, and the idea of a place with no distractions, just the ocean, some hiking, and an old lighthouse to explore sounded perfect. We didn't think it through, honestly. No one told us how empty and silent the island would feel when we arrived. The boat ride out was long. I spent most of it staring out over the water, the waves rolling gently under the boat, wondering if maybe we had made a mistake. Emily, on the other hand, couldn't have been more excited. She kept pointing out small islands we passed, commenting on how beautiful the coastline looked. But the closer we got to our destination, the quieter I felt. The island looked untouched, eerie in its isolation. The lighthouse, an old stone structure standing tall on the cliff, seemed almost like it had been forgotten by time. There was no sound, no birds calling, no crashing waves, just silence. We made our way to the beach, where the boat was anchored, and dragged our bags ashore. The air was thick with salt, and the wind had a strange chill to it. We made our way inland, following a narrow path that led toward the lighthouse. It was hard to make out much through the dense fog, but I had that feeling, the one where the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like something wasn't quite right. But Emily was laughing, calling out how much she loved the adventure, so I did my best to push the feeling aside. And then we found them. Footprints. Fresh ones. They led straight toward the lighthouse. "Someone's here?" Emily asked, clearly not as uneasy as I was. "Maybe the caretaker?" I didn't answer. My throat had gone dry. The prints weren't recent, but they weren't old either. They weren't left by anyone who had been here years ago, not like those we had seen in old, abandoned houses. These looked too fresh. I scanned the area, hoping to spot anyone nearby. But there was no one. "Let's go check out the lighthouse," I suggested, hoping to shake off the growing dread creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I had this overwhelming sense that we weren't supposed to be here. Emily smiled and led the way, her excitement still unshaken. But as I followed her toward the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The footprints, the emptiness, everything about this place seemed off. Something about the island felt like it was waiting for us, like it had been waiting for a long time. When we reached the lighthouse, I didn't expect to find much. But the door was open, creaking on its hinges as if inviting us in. Emily didn't hesitate. She stepped inside first, and I followed reluctantly. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of salt and decay hung heavily in the air. The windows were cracked, and the light from outside barely filtered through the grime. There were signs of neglect, old chairs turned over, cobwebs hanging from the rafters, but nothing that seemed dangerous. Still, I felt uneasy. Emily wandered toward the stairs, but something stopped me from following. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the darkness at the top of the stairs, or maybe it was the overwhelming quiet. I stood frozen in place, my eyes scanning the room again. That's when I heard it. A soft scuffle. A footstep. It wasn't Emily. She was still upstairs, talking about something I wasn't really listening to. My heart skipped a beat. There was someone else here. I knew it. I waited, listening, but the sound never came again. I glanced back toward the door, unsure whether I should stay or leave. But something told me that if I left now, I wouldn't be able to shake the feeling that we had just missed something important. I took a deep breath and forced myself to go up the stairs, trying to ignore the gnawing sense that we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. The higher I climbed, the heavier the air became. When I reached the top, Emily was standing by the railing, staring out over the island. She didn't hear me approach. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily turned to me with a smile, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't place.
"Yeah."
"I just feel like we're not the only ones here," she said, her voice trembling just a little. I froze. The island was silent again, but in the silence, I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone moving below us. The footsteps. They were getting closer. I thought I'd imagined it at first. The footsteps. The soft shuffle that had made my stomach twist. But as I stood there, staring at Emily, I realized that something wasn't right. She hadn't heard it, but I was sure now. Someone, or something, was moving around down there. I could feel my heart pounding, a cold sweat slowly forming on the back of my neck. Emily was still looking out over the island, completely unaware of the shift in the air. She was speaking again, but her words barely registered. My mind was racing. Who could be here? We hadn't seen anyone when we arrived, and there were no signs of life on the island. The tracks we'd found leading to the lighthouse were fresh, but not recent enough to indicate any living person. And yet, the footsteps kept coming closer. "Emily," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "did you hear that?" She turned, her smile fading as she looked at me, noticing the panic in my eyes. "Heard what?" she asked, frowning. She didn't seem worried. She never did. She was the optimist in our relationship, the one who always saw the good in everything. I envied her for that, but right now, I wished she'd feel what I was feeling. "Footsteps," I whispered, "coming from below." Her expression softened, like she was humoring me. "There's no one here, babe. Maybe it's the wind or something." But I knew better. The footsteps weren't random. They were deliberate. It wasn't the wind. I moved toward the top of the lighthouse stairs, trying to peer through the grime-covered windows. The fog outside had thickened, casting everything in a gray, suffocating haze. The island seemed even more deserted now, as if the world had just vanished. I turned back to Emily. "Let's get out of here." She raised an eyebrow.
"Why?"
"We just got here." "I don't know," I said, trying to hide the fear in my voice. "I just have this bad feeling. Something's wrong, Em." Emily rolled her eyes, but she was starting to look a little uneasy. She could tell I wasn't joking. "All right, fine," she said. "But let's at least check out the rest of the island first. We're here, aren't we? Might as well make the most of it." I wanted to argue, to pull her away and leave the island behind, but something inside me told me it was already too late for that. We'd come here, and whatever was happening on this island, it wasn't going to let us leave that easily. Reluctantly, I followed her as she made her way down the stairs. My eyes never left the dark corners of the lighthouse, but nothing moved. Not even a shadow. When we reached the bottom, the silence was almost suffocating. Emily was already moving toward the door, seemingly carefree, as if nothing had changed. But my senses were on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, made my skin crawl. It was as though the island itself was breathing, and we were intruders in its lair. We stepped outside, and the fog seemed even thicker now, wrapping around us like a shroud. The distant sound of waves crashing against rocks was muted, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "You're being paranoid," Emily said, but there was a hesitation in her voice now, too. Maybe she could feel it too. Whatever it was. "Let's just check out the shore," I suggested, desperate to break the tension. "Maybe we'll find something. We can't just sit here, right?" Emily nodded, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. But we started walking anyway, heading toward the edge of the island. The path was overgrown, but still passable. It was quiet, unnervingly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we reached the beach, I finally dared to speak what had been bothering me since we first arrived. "I keep thinking someone's here with us. I don't know, it's like I feel eyes on me." Emily stopped in her tracks, scanning the horizon, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Who would be here? We're completely alone." That's when we heard it. The soft sound of movement in the trees behind us. I froze. There was no wind, no animal that could make that noise. But someone, something, was definitely out there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. Emily's face drained of color as she turned slowly, her eyes darting from side to side. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. And then we heard something else. A voice. Low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within the ground. It was a sound I couldn't place, but it was unmistakably human. "Help me." The voice was faint, but it was there, somewhere just beyond the trees. Without thinking, I grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the boat. "We need to leave. Right now." But before we could take another step, the fog parted, and we saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, moving toward us. There were 3 of them, and their faces. I'll never forget their faces. Twisted, unrecognizable. They were smiling. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened with every second that passed. The figures, those people or whatever they were, slowly approached us, their feet making no sound against the earth. They weren't walking like normal people. Their movements were stiff, jerky, as if they were trying to mimic something human, but couldn't quite get it right. The fog was thickening again, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. I could barely make out their faces, but the sense of dread I felt was overwhelming. They weren't just people, they were something else. Something unnatural. "Run!" I gasped, but Emily didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the figures, her body frozen in place. I tugged at her arm, but it was like she couldn't hear me. She just stood there, staring, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I didn't understand. Why wasn't she moving? Why wasn't she scared? And then I realized she couldn't see them. I turned my head back toward the figures, my stomach dropping when I saw that they were closer now, almost within arm's reach. Their faces, those twisted, contorted faces, were burned into my mind. They looked wrong. Their skin was pale, almost gray, their eyes sunken, their lips stretched into grotesque, inhuman smiles. "Emily!" I shouted, shaking her, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. But before I could make another move, one of the figures reached out, its hand coming for me. I recoiled, but it was too late. It grabbed my wrist with a vice-like grip, its fingers icy cold. I screamed, struggling to break free, but the thing's hold was unyielding. It didn't even seem to be trying to hurt me, at least, not yet. It was just holding me, like it was savoring the fear, like it wanted me to feel every moment of terror before whatever came next. "Help me," the voice croaked again, this time so close it sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I twisted my head around, and for a split second, I thought I saw another figure standing just beyond the first. This one wasn't like the others. Its eyes were wide, terrified, its mouth stretched into an agonized scream. But the scream was silent, its voice trapped somewhere in the depths of the fog. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing for an escape, but all I could think about was Emily. She was still standing there, her eyes locked on the fog, as if she could sense something was wrong but couldn't see what I saw. I had to get her out of there. "Emily, listen to me," I screamed, trying to make her see the danger, to make her snap out of whatever trance she was in. "We need to go. Now." Finally, she blinked, as if coming out of a daze. She looked around, her eyes scanning the beach in confusion. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's no time for questions." I yanked her again, this time harder, pulling her toward the boat. The figures were still there, moving closer, but their expressions were changing. Now they were grinning. Wide, grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. We stumbled toward the boat, my heart racing as I kept my eyes on the figures, watching as they began to move faster. Their limbs were jerking now, as if they were gaining momentum, their grotesque smiles growing wider, their eyes filled with something hungry. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear their footsteps now, growing louder, closer, a rhythmic, unnatural sound that sent chills down my spine. "Emily, paddle. We have to go," I screamed, pushing her toward the boat. I could feel my breath coming in sharp gasps, my body shaking with fear. We had to get off this island now. She fumbled with the oars, her hands trembling as she tried to figure out how to start the boat, but the figures were almost on us. The air around us was thick with their presence, their cold energy pressing down on me, suffocating me. A loud splash broke the tension, and I snapped my head up, seeing one of the figures lunging toward us from the shore. It moved impossibly fast, its mouth wide open in a silent scream, and before I could react, it was in the water, coming straight for us. I shoved Emily into the boat. "Go, go," I screamed. She finally started rowing, her arms shaking, but the figure was gaining on us. It was moving faster than any human should be able to move in the water. I didn't know how much time we had. I didn't know how far we'd have to go, but the island was already receding into the distance, the figures still standing on the shore, watching us, their eyes never leaving us. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see them fading into the fog, but instead, they were still there, watching. Their faces weren't just twisted anymore, they were contorted with rage. They weren't just watching us leave. They were waiting. And I knew, deep in my gut, that they weren't going to let us escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the island behind us or the way the fog clung to the horizon like a suffocating blanket. No, it was the whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, but now, as we paddled farther from the island, they were growing louder. Almost like voices just below the surface of the water, calling out to us. I kept looking back, expecting to see the silhouettes of those figures standing on the shore, their haunting eyes following our every move. But the further we got, the more I realized we weren't just running from something on the island. The island itself felt alive, like it had noticed us leaving, and now it wanted us back. "Emily, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I had to know. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining it. She paused for a moment, gripping the oars tightly, her face pale and strained. She didn't answer immediately, which made my heart sink. "I don't hear anything," she finally said, but there was something off in her tone. She didn't sound as sure as she usually did. I glanced over my shoulder again, half expecting one of those figures to be standing on the water, walking toward us with unnatural ease. But there was nothing. Just the empty expanse of the sea, the dark water rippling gently in the moonlight. I wanted to tell her everything. How the island wasn't just cursed, it was alive. The fog, the whispers, the way the figures had moved. How they were still out there, somewhere, watching us. I wanted to scream it all out, to make her believe me, but the fear that had settled deep inside of me made it hard to speak. Emily paddled harder, her arms working with more urgency now. We had to get off the water. We had to reach the mainland, wherever it was. But every time I looked back, it felt like the darkness behind us was creeping closer. Not just in the water, but in the air around us. The cold that had taken hold of the island was still here, as if it had followed us, hitching a ride on the boat. "Come on, Emily." "Faster," I urged, my voice almost pleading. I wanted to get as far away from the island as possible. I'm trying," she snapped back, her voice shaking. But the more we paddled, the more exhausted she looked. Her face was flushed, sweat beading on her forehead, but her movements were slow, like she was losing strength with every stroke. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the boat, a shadow. A shape in the water, too large to be a fish or anything natural, moving beneath the surface, its movements deliberate and slow. "Did you see that?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. "What?" Emily asked, still focused on rowing. But I could see her eyes flicking nervously toward the water. "There's something out there," I muttered. "Something moving. It's watching us." I couldn't tell her what I really thought, that the figures, those things from the island, were now in the water, following us, or that the shadows weren't just shadows, but a part of something worse. I couldn't make her believe that we weren't alone anymore. She kept rowing, the sound of the oars hitting the water louder in the silence. But the shadow kept moving, following us at a distance, always just out of sight when I turned to look. And then there was the whisper again. Louder this time. Clearer. "Help me, help me, it's too late." The voice, deep and guttural, came from beneath the water. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything from this world. I couldn't breathe. I felt the pressure in my chest build, suffocating me. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I gripped the edge of the boat, terrified to look over the side. "Emily!" I gasped, my voice hoarse. "We need to hurry." She didn't answer. Her hands were shaking now, and she had stopped paddling, staring ahead, wide-eyed. "Emily, what's wrong?" Her gaze locked onto the water just beside us, and I followed her stare. There, in the inky blackness of the sea, I saw them, the figures, their faces distorted, their hands reaching out from the deep, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were in the water, and they were coming closer. I screamed and grabbed for the oars, but Emily was frozen, paralyzed by the sight. I couldn't get her moving, couldn't get us away fast enough. The water around us started to churn violently, as if the sea itself was fighting against us. "Emily, row." "No." Finally she moved, but it was too late. The boat tipped. One moment, we were struggling to stay afloat, and the next, we were in the water. Cold, suffocating water filled my lungs. I gasped, my body twisting in panic as I tried to reach for the boat. My fingers slipped against the slick surface, and when I looked up, there they were. The figures. They weren't just in the water. They were rising from it, walking toward us, their grins wide, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they came closer and closer. I couldn't hear anything but the deafening rush of my own heartbeat. And then, just as I thought I was going to drown, something, or someone, gripped my arm. "Help me," the voice whispered again, too close, right by my ear. And I knew, without a doubt, that the voice wasn't just coming from one of them. It was coming from something even worse, something that had been waiting for us from the moment we set foot on that cursed island. I woke up to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, my entire body aching. My chest was raw, my skin stinging with salt water. I could barely move. My arms felt like lead, and when I tried to open my eyes, everything was blurred, dark. My head throbbed like someone had hit me with a hammer. "Emily!" I croaked, my voice barely a whisper, dry and cracked. There was no answer. I forced myself to sit up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The island was still, too still. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, hanging like a heavy curtain over everything. I could barely see the shoreline, but I knew I wasn't in the boat anymore. I wasn't even sure where the boat was. The air was damp, cold, and it carried that oppressive feeling again. The weight, the same heaviness that had settled in my chest the moment we arrived. I looked around, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. "Where is Emily?" I tried to call out again, but my voice was barely there, like it was being smothered by the fog itself. My fingers trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, scanning the area for any sign of her. But there was nothing. No boat. No Emily. Not even the strange figures. The island had swallowed us whole. Then I noticed something, a flash of movement at the edge of the fog. A figure. It was standing by the rocks, just out of my reach. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen. Was it her? "Emily!" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. I took a cautious step forward, my feet slipping on the wet ground. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the sound of the crashing waves. Another step, then another. And then I saw it, the figure's face. It was pale, twisted, its eyes wide open, black pits of nothing. Its mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong on a human face, a grin that was far too wide, too unsettling. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, its gaze burning into my soul. I didn't wait for it to do anything. I turned and ran like I had never run before. My legs were weak, my body screaming in pain, but I didn't stop. I pushed forward, my feet sliding against the muddy ground, my lungs burning. I had to get off this island. I had to escape. As I ran, I could hear the whispers again. Low, guttural sounds that wrapped around my mind, filling it with dread. The voices were everywhere, coming from the fog, the trees, the very earth beneath me. They were calling to me, urging me to stop. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Get out. Get out now. I stumbled through the fog, my vision blurred, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stay here. Not with those things, not with whatever it was that had followed me from the island. And then I saw it, just ahead, through the mist. The boat. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't right. It was different. The boat was there, yes, but it was upside down, its hull battered and broken. It was half submerged in the water, as though it had been tossed around by some invisible force. And worse, standing in front of it, Emily. She was standing perfectly still, facing the wreckage, her back turned to me. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and wet. She didn't move as I called her name, my voice frantic, desperate. I stumbled toward her, but the closer I got, the heavier the air became. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Emily!" I yelled, my voice cracking. She finally turned her head. But it wasn't Emily. Not anymore. Her face was a mask of decay, her eyes sunken deep into her skull, the flesh hanging loosely from her bones. A twisted, unnatural smile stretched across her face. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice cold, hollow. It was her voice, but it wasn't. I froze, unable to speak, unable to move. My body was paralyzed with terror as I realized the truth. The island, the thing on the island, had taken her. It had taken Emily, and now it was taking me. I reached for the boat, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath me gave way, and I collapsed. The last thing I saw was Emily, or what had once been Emily, moving toward me, her arms outstretched, as the fog closed in around us. And then, nothing. Just darkness. I woke up again. This time, I wasn't sure if I was still alive, or if I had finally slipped into the island's grip. But I didn't care anymore. I knew it was too late. The whispers were all I could hear now, and they were mine.
The Curse of the Black Isle.
It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months. 7 days on Black Island, a secluded tropical paradise, far away from the stress of work and daily life. No phones, no distractions, just sun, sand, and the kind of peace you only get when you're completely off the grid. The island looked like something straight out of a postcard. Crystal clear waters, lush jungle, and beaches that stretched for miles, untouched by human hands. As soon as we arrived, we couldn't help but feel like we were stepping into a dream. The kind of place where you could forget everything else. We spent the first day exploring the beach, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the perfect weather. It was bliss. But then, on the second day, things took a strange turn. It was Alex who found the stone. We were hiking along a narrow path that wound through the jungle when we stumbled into a clearing. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a large black stone. It wasn't anything like the other rocks on the island. This one was smooth, glossy, almost like it had been polished by someone or something. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just some weird geological formation, a leftover relic of some ancient past. But Alex, being Alex, wasn't content with just admiring it from a distance. He walked right up to it, crouched down, and grabbed it. "Guys, check this out," he called, holding it up in his hands. His voice was excited, but there was something off about the way he said it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way he looked at the stone, the way he turned it over in his hands, it was like he was transfixed. "It's smooth," he said, running his fingers over the surface. "It's cold, like it's been sitting here for centuries." I wasn't sure what made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way the stone seemed to gleam even in the shadow of the trees, or the fact that the jungle around us had suddenly gone quiet, like the birds and insects had all stopped making noise. But Alex was already packing it up in his shirt, ready to take it with him. "We should leave it here," I said, trying to sound casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it's a sacred site or something. Who knows? But Alex was already shrugging me off, laughing it off like I was being paranoid. "Nah, I'm keeping it. It'll make a great souvenir. No one's been here for years, so who's gonna care?" I didn't push the issue any further. It wasn't like I could stop him, and part of me told myself I was overreacting. But deep down, something in my gut told me that picking up that stone wasn't just some innocent mistake. It was a decision that would change everything. I just didn't know how much yet. As we made our way back to camp, I felt a sense of unease settle over me. The island that had been so vibrant and alive earlier that day now seemed strangely still. The trees, once full of life, looked darker, their shadows stretching longer as the sun began to set. The air felt thicker, heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. But when we returned to the camp, everything seemed fine. The group was still gathered around the fire, laughing and joking, none the wiser about the stone Alex had found. That night, we sat around the campfire, telling stories, drinking, and enjoying our time together. But as the hours passed, I noticed something strange. The island didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me. But then, when the fire started to die down, and we were just sitting there in the dark, I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too clear, too distinct. It was almost like a voice, a soft, low murmur that seemed to come from the direction of the jungle. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was just imagining things. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded like my name. I stood up abruptly, startling the others. "Did anyone hear that?" Alex looked at me, his face slightly pale. What are you talking about?" "I thought I heard something," I said, my voice shaky. "Like a whisper. It sounded like—" But before I could finish, the jungle fell completely silent. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just silence. The others laughed it off, saying I was just hearing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching us. And it all started with that damn stone. Little did we know, we had just awoken something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries, and we were about to pay the price. The next morning, I woke up with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake. The air felt thick, like the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The others were still asleep, scattered around the campfire from the night before. I could hear the waves crashing in the distance, but there was no sound of the usual tropical birds or the rustling of leaves. It was too quiet. Alex was already up, sitting by the edge of the clearing, staring at the stone he had taken from the jungle the day before. It was strange. I hadn't heard him get up, but there he was, still clutching the stone tightly in his hands. His face was pale, eyes wide as if he'd been up for hours. I approached cautiously, trying not to wake anyone else. "Alex, you okay?" He looked up slowly, and when our eyes met, there was something different about him. His expression was blank, almost hollow. "Yeah, just thinking," he said, but his voice was off. It wasn't like the usual carefree Alex I knew. It was distant, almost disconnected. "Dude, you're freaking me out. What's going on?" He didn't respond immediately. He just stared down at the stone, then back up at me, his lips twitching into a faint, unsettling smile. "I think the island is calling me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know how to react. I tried to laugh it off, but it didn't feel right. Alex was the last person to get spooked by anything, yet now, it was like he wasn't even there. "Come on, man," I said, trying to bring him back to reality. "It's just a rock. Maybe we should put it back." He didn't answer. He just held it tighter, his fingers turning white from the pressure. I left him there, unsure of what to do. The rest of the day passed without much happening. We hiked around the island again, the others none the wiser, laughing and chatting like usual. But I noticed that Alex's mood was only getting worse. He wasn't joking around anymore, barely speaking at all. Every time we stopped to rest, he would stare off into the distance, and if I looked closely, I could see him clutching the stone in his bag. By sunset, we had returned to camp. The night fell quickly, and as the fire crackled, I felt that same unease from the night before. But this time, it was worse. There was an oppressive weight in the air, and the island felt wrong. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. My skin tingled, like I was being watched. That's when the first one disappeared. It was David. He had wandered off to gather firewood, just like he had done the day before. But this time, he didn't come back. At first, we all assumed he had just gotten lost. It wasn't that big of a deal. He was always wandering off on his own. But after an hour passed, and then 2, we started to get worried. We called out his name, but no answer. The jungle was eerily silent. Not a single sound. I couldn't explain it. It was like the island had swallowed him whole. We searched the area, calling for him, but there was no sign. No tracks, no broken branches. It was like he had just vanished. At that point, I knew something was horribly wrong. The island, which had seemed so beautiful and untouched at first, now felt like a place that was hiding something dark and ancient. But the others brushed it off, convinced he had just gotten lost. They wanted to stay optimistic, even though the air was thick with tension. That night, the whispers came again. But this time, they were louder. I could hear them clearly now. Soft, low voices, coming from the edge of the jungle. It sounded like they were calling my name, and I swear, I could feel them getting closer, like something was moving through the trees, just out of sight. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't explain it, but I was paralyzed with fear. My heart was pounding, my body frozen in place as I listened to the whispers get closer and closer. Suddenly, I heard something in the distance. A thud. Then another. A rustling noise, like something or someone was moving through the jungle. It was Alex. He had gotten up from his spot by the fire and was walking into the jungle, moving slowly, as if in a trance. The stone was clutched tightly in his hands, and his eyes were glazed, completely unseeing. "Alex!" I shouted, running after him. But he didn't respond. He just kept walking, moving deeper into the jungle, as if he was being pulled by some unseen force. I grabbed his arm, shaking him, but he didn't even flinch. He didn't recognize me. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost like a low growl. But then it grew louder. A deep, guttural sound, coming from the darkness beyond the trees. I felt it vibrating in my chest, like it was coming from something far, far bigger than anything human. And that's when I realized we weren't alone. Alex was still staring at the stone in his hands, muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. They didn't sound like anything I recognized. Suddenly, the growl became a roar, and everything went still. Alex looked up at me, his eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw a flash of fear in them. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Then, from the jungle, something moved. It was fast, too fast for me to react. A shadow, a blur, and then Alex was gone. No scream, no sound. He was just gone. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had no idea what just happened. But one thing was clear now. We were being hunted, and there was no escape from this island. Not anymore. The air was suffocating. I could barely catch my breath as I stood there, alone in the jungle, staring at the spot where Alex had disappeared. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, echoing in my ears. I didn't know what had just happened, or how Alex could vanish so completely, but I had no time to figure it out. Not anymore. The growl from the jungle was still ringing in my head. Deep, animalistic, like something that didn't belong on this island, something that shouldn't exist. My hands were shaking as I tried to force myself to think, to figure out what the hell was going on. I couldn't stand there forever, frozen in terror. I had to move. I had to find the others. But the jungle around me had changed. The trees that had once looked so beautiful and peaceful now seemed ominous, their twisted branches like claws reaching out to grab me. The whispers were back, creeping in from the edges of my consciousness, like soft voices calling my name, trying to draw me further into the darkness. I fought the urge to follow, to listen to the whispers, but it was so hard to resist. I turned back toward the camp, my legs feeling like jelly. I had to warn the others. But the more I walked, the more the island seemed to close in on me. The sky above was growing darker, even though the sun hadn't fully set. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the whole island was holding its breath. Something wasn't right. Something was coming. By the time I stumbled back to camp, the fire had nearly gone out. The others were gathered around it, but they weren't laughing or talking. They were all staring at me, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. They must have heard the roar, the growls, everything. What the hell happened to Alex? Sam's voice cracked. He was one of the last people I would expect to look shaken, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to grab him. He wouldn't listen. He just disappeared. I couldn't even explain it, not fully. I wasn't sure if I even believed it myself. How could someone just vanish like that? "You're not serious," Lily said, shaking her head. She stood up, looking around nervously, as if expecting Alex to just step out from behind the trees. What happened to him? He couldn't have just vanished, right? I opened my mouth to respond, but then it hit me, the absence of the normal island sounds. The hum of insects, the chirping of birds, it was all gone. It was silent. Too silent. "That's not the worst part," I said, my voice cracking. "There's something on this island. Something." A low, guttural growl echoed from the trees, cutting me off. It was louder than before, closer, and I knew in that instant that whatever it was right outside our camp. Something was circling us, hunting us. We all froze. I could see the fear on their faces, just as I felt it crawling under my skin. "Do you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is that?" The sound wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, like it was coming from the earth itself. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, through my bones, and I knew that whatever it was close. Then the whispers came again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they sounded familiar. Run, run. It was as if the voices were in my head. The whispers weren't coming from the jungle anymore. They were inside my mind, echoing and growing louder, urging me to run, to leave the camp behind and escape. But where would I go? The island was a prison, a maze of trees and shadows. "Get ready," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave. We can't stay here." But before anyone could react, the ground beneath us trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, but something heavy moving, something massive. I could feel the vibrations in the air, the trees swaying, the fire flickering wildly. The sound was coming closer. I turned to run, to get to the edge of the camp, but I didn't get far before I felt something grab my leg. I looked down to see my foot tangled in thick, vine-like roots, pulling me into the dirt. "Help!" I screamed, trying to pull my leg free, but it was no use. The roots were tightening, pulling me down, dragging me closer to the ground. The others rushed to my side, but as they tried to pull me free, something in the jungle answered. A shape emerged from the trees. It was tall, too tall, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky gait. The creature's skin was pale, almost white, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. It was no animal I'd ever seen. Its face was twisted in a grotesque grin, with jagged teeth that looked more like broken bones. I froze, my blood turning cold. The others screamed. Sam and Lily tried to grab me, but their hands slipped off the roots, as if the jungle itself didn't want us to escape. The creature stepped closer, its hollow eyes locked on me. The whispers grew louder in my mind, urging me to give in, to surrender. It was hunting me. It was hunting all of us. Then everything went black. I woke up to the feeling of cold stone beneath me. My head was pounding, my vision blurry as I tried to sit up, my body aching in ways I couldn't comprehend. The last thing I remembered was that creature, those glowing eyes. And then everything went dark. I rubbed my eyes, struggling to make sense of where I was. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The jungle's noises were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that sent chills down my spine. It felt wrong, unnaturally wrong. I glanced around. The trees, the camp, none of it was where I last saw it. In fact, there was no sign of the camp at all. All I could see was dense, tangled foliage surrounding me, stretching out into the distance. How had I gotten here? Was I alone? I tried to stand up, but my legs were unsteady. My heart raced as I realized I had no idea how long I'd been unconscious, how far I'd been dragged, or worse, taken. Panic began to crawl under my skin. "Sam, Lily, Mark," I called out weakly, my voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, not even an echo. I tried to take a step forward, but the ground felt wrong under my feet, soft and spongy. The thick vines twisted around my ankles like hands, trying to hold me in place. I pulled my feet free, barely able to take another step before I heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. That sound was real. It was here. "Not again," I muttered under my breath, my legs trembling with fear. I forced myself to move, pushing through the thick underbrush, each step more difficult than the last. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't just one growl, it was a horde. My mind raced, trying to piece together anything that could explain what was happening. The island had already shown its true face, and now we were all being hunted. I stumbled through the trees, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every snap of a twig sounded like it was someone, or something, closing in. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running from something. I was running toward something. And then it hit me. The whispers. They were back. Low and insistent, like a chant that wasn't quite real. You can't escape. You're already here. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. That voice, it wasn't coming from the jungle. It was coming from inside me. I wasn't just being hunted by the creature. I was being hunted by the island itself. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, the trees bending inward, creating a maze that I couldn't navigate. I was disoriented, lost. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that I wasn't just lost in the jungle. The island had become a maze, its very nature shifting and changing with each passing second, making it impossible to escape. Then I heard it. A faint cry in the distance. A scream. Sam's voice. I ran toward it, pushing through the undergrowth, desperate to find them. To find anyone. When I reached the clearing, I froze. Sam was there, but he wasn't moving. His body was sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open but lifeless. A thick, dark liquid pooled around him, making the dirt sticky and foul. My stomach churned as I approached him cautiously, my legs heavy, each step harder than the last. I reached out, touching his shoulder, but as I did, something stopped me. A sound. Footsteps. Coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Nothing except the dense trees and the creeping fog that had rolled in. The very air seemed to be pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whispers were louder now. They were coming from all directions, swirling around me like a wind that didn't exist. But there was one whisper I could hear clearer than the rest. He's not dead. Yet. I turned back to Sam's body, my breath catching. He wasn't dead, was he? But then how could he still be? The answer hit me like a slap. The island wasn't just hunting us. It was toying with us. It was feeding on our fear, our confusion. The curse wasn't just some old legend. It was real. And whatever had claimed Sam wasn't finished with him yet. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay. I had to find Lily and Mark, and we had to leave the island now. But as I turned to run again, something caught my eye. A figure, standing motionless just beyond the trees. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It was the creature. The one from before. And this time, it was closer than ever. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat as the creature stepped closer. Its eyes glowed with a sickening, unnatural light, and the air around it seemed to hum with dark energy, like the very atmosphere was bending to its will. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, backing away slowly, every nerve screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The jungle had closed in around me, the trees twisting and bending into shapes that no longer looked natural, almost like the island itself was a living thing, watching, waiting. The whispers from before were back, louder now, filling my ears with voices that didn't belong to any human. You can't leave. You're already one of us. I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out. I needed to. The creature lunged. I barely had time to react. It was faster than I thought, its long, spindly arms reaching for me with unnatural speed. I stumbled back, tripping over a vine, and fell to the ground, the creature's sharp claws grazing the air just above my face. I scrambled, using every ounce of strength I had left to push myself to my feet. But it wasn't over. It would never be over. The island, the curse, it wanted me. I ran again, my legs moving on pure instinct. I didn't know where I was going, I didn't care. I could hear the creature behind me, its breath raspy and heavy, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble with every step it took. And then, just as I thought I was going to be caught, I saw it, a clearing, a gap between the trees that led to the edge of the island. The water. If I could just make it there, maybe I could swim to the mainland. Maybe I could survive. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline coursing through my veins, the crashing of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. But the moment I reached the edge of the island, my hope shattered. The water was black, swirling with an unnatural force, and as I looked closer, I could see it moving, not from the wind or the waves, but from something beneath the surface. Something alive. My body froze. I should have turned around. I should have run back into the jungle, but I couldn't. It was like the island had already claimed me, already locked me into this nightmare, and now there was no escape. That's when I heard a familiar voice. Lily. I spun around. It was Mark, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Mark! I screamed, relief flooding through me, but it quickly turned to horror as I saw him standing there, not moving, his body tense as if he was frozen in place. No, I whispered, taking a step back. No, no, no. The creature's growl echoed from behind me. I didn't need to look to know it was there. I could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of its presence suffocating me. And then Mark spoke. Run. But the words weren't his. I looked closer, and that's when I saw it. Mark's eyes were no longer his. They were empty, black pits staring into mine with an almost alien malice. It wasn't him. It was the curse, the thing that had already taken him. He was just a shell, a puppet, and the island was controlling him. The creature screeched, its voice a sound so horrible it sent a jolt of terror through me, and Mark, no, the thing that had once been Mark, lurched toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. I turned and ran, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I sprinted back into the jungle, the sound of Mark's footsteps, no longer human, following close behind. I didn't know where I was running anymore. I didn't care. All I could think about was survival. I had to get away. I had to. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into a pit, my body slamming against the cold earth below. I lay there for a moment, dazed and gasping for breath, but the panic didn't stop. I was trapped. From above, I heard it again, the screech, the growl, and the whispers. You can't escape. You're ours. I looked around, my breath catching as I saw the flicker of movement in the shadows. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The creature was there, its glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the pit. It was smiling, if that's even what you could call it. A twisted, jagged grin that sent ice through my veins. And then I understood. This wasn't just a curse. This was a hunt. And I was the prey. No one was coming for me. No one would hear my screams. This island, it had no mercy. It never had. And now, I was part of its nightmare. It was too late.
The Abandoned Island.
It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a chance to escape the stress of our daily lives, to unwind and enjoy some peace and quiet. My friends and I had been planning it for months. A remote island off the coast of Maine, miles away from civilization, promised just what we needed. We'd heard rumors about it being uninhabited, a place untouched by the modern world. It sounded perfect for an adventurous group of friends like us. The boat ride over was calm, almost too calm. The water was smooth, the sky overcast, casting everything in a strange, quiet light. We laughed and joked, as friends do, pointing out random things in the distance, but there was a subtle tension in the air. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the isolation of the island unnerved me. As we approached the island, the first thing that struck me was how silent it was. No birds, no animals, not even the sound of the wind rustling the trees. Just nothing. We docked the boat and stepped off onto the shore, the rough sand crunching under our feet. The island looked almost forgotten, like it had been abandoned a long time ago and left to rot. The trees were thick, their trunks twisted and overgrown with vines. The grass was wild, reaching up higher than I expected. It felt like the island had been neglected, but not in a natural way. More like it had been deliberately left behind. "Weird, right?" Jason said, breaking the silence. He was the first to step forward, clearly excited to explore. The rest of us followed, though none of us spoke much. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't figure out what. It wasn't until we ventured a little deeper into the island that we saw it, the remnants of a village, hidden in the thick trees. We stumbled upon crumbling buildings, small houses, their windows shattered, roofs caving in. Some structures had been overtaken by nature, vines and moss growing through the broken walls. At first, it seemed like we were just walking through an old ghost town, but something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of decay. The farther we went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that this place had been abandoned for a reason. "Look at this," Sarah said, pulling my attention to a set of strange markings carved into one of the stone walls. They weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, methodical. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to brush off the unease creeping into my voice. But the longer I stared at the markings, the more unsettled I felt. They seemed to glow faintly, almost like they were alive. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, but the eerie feeling only grew stronger. The more we wandered, the more I noticed things that didn't make sense. Old furniture left behind, half buried in the dirt, a broken door hanging off its hinges, as if someone had left in a hurry. I tried to convince myself it was just an old, forgotten place, but something in my gut told me there was more to it. By sunset, we decided to set up camp near the shoreline, as far from the village as possible. I figured a night under the stars would help clear my head. But as the last light of day faded and the darkness settled over us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone on this island. As the fire crackled, we sat around it, drinking and talking, but the quiet seemed unnatural, like the island itself was holding its breath. The wind picked up, brushing the tops of the trees, and I thought I heard something, voices. Soft whispers carried on the breeze. I turned to Jason, who had his head tilted, listening intently. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like someone's talking." "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah suggested, trying to sound casual, but I could tell she was unnerved too. Still, we didn't leave the campfire. We stayed close, too close, as if the fire would keep whatever was out there away. The whispers continued, just faint enough to make us question if we were hearing things, but strong enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be. The wind, the trees, the island settling into night, it was probably just that. But something kept tugging at me, a feeling deep down in my gut that told me there was more to this place than met the eye. As I lay in my tent that night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct and closer. I tried to ignore them, tried to drown them out by covering my head with a blanket. But I couldn't sleep. My heart raced, and every sound outside made my skin crawl. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft footstep, followed by another. It wasn't the sound of our boots or shoes. These were lighter, quieter, like someone was trying not to be heard. Someone was out there, and I wasn't sure if they were watching us, or if they were waiting for us to make the next move. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could hear was the faint whispering in the distance, carried by the wind, or was it something else? It was hard to tell in the darkness. The fire was dimming now, barely lighting the edges of our campsite. Everyone else seemed to be sleeping, their breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps outside my tent were the first thing that snapped me out of my thoughts. At first, I convinced myself it was just one of the others, maybe Jason or Sarah, up for a midnight walk or to check the fire. But the steps were soft, deliberate, almost like they were trying to avoid making noise. The sound came closer, and then stopped just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I lay perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. The footsteps had stopped. Whoever it was had stopped moving. For a long moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. And then, just as I was about to let out a sigh of relief, I heard it again, a soft, raspy whisper. "Hello." The voice was low, almost a breath, and it came from directly outside my tent. My heart slammed against my chest. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my throat felt tight, like my voice wouldn't come. The voice didn't sound like any of us. It wasn't any of my friends. It wasn't even human. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Maybe a bird or something else making strange noises. But this voice, it wasn't right. It wasn't animalistic. It sounded desperate, almost pleading, as if it was trying to lure me out. The seconds felt like hours as I waited, barely daring to breathe. I told myself I was just imagining things, that it was all in my head. But then there was another voice, this one closer and more distinct. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a chill down my spine, a coldness that seemed to seep into my very bones. That was enough. I scrambled for the zipper of my tent, almost frantic now. My hands were shaking as I tried to pull it open, but before I could manage, the voices stopped, abruptly. And then there was nothing. Complete silence. I sat in my tent, eyes wide, staring at the dark canvas in front of me, my heart still pounding in my ears. What the hell was that? I waited for what seemed like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth, watching the shadowy shapes outside, trying to make out any movement. But there was nothing. The island had returned to its eerie stillness, like nothing had happened. I had to find out what was going on. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent, sticking my head out just enough to see the campfire, which was now a weak flicker. I looked around, my eyes scanning the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. Something was watching me. "Sarah," I whispered, trying to sound calm. "Jason." There was no response. Not even a rustle from the other tents. I called out again, louder this time, but still no answer. My gut twisted, a sick feeling bubbling up in my stomach. I pushed out of the tent and stood in the cold night air, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. I glanced toward the woods, the trees standing like dark sentinels, unmoving. They felt alive, almost as if they were hiding something just out of sight. My eyes scanned the edge of the campsite, searching for any sign of movement, but the night was silent, save for the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. I took a few cautious steps toward the campfire, my eyes darting back to the tents. There was no one there. No one at all. Panic surged in my chest, and I stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over the cool, uneven ground. My breath quickened, and I was about to yell for help when I heard it again. A soft step behind me, barely audible but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Just trees. I ran back to the tents, my feet slipping on the grass as I fumbled with the zipper to get inside. I bolted the flaps shut, my hands shaking as I crawled into my sleeping bag, pulling it tightly around me as if it would somehow protect me. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but the weight of the silence pressed down on me, suffocating. There was no escaping the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not here. Not on this island. I closed my eyes, praying that when I opened them again, it would all be gone, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This place, this island, it was hiding something. Something ancient. Something that had been here long before we ever arrived. I could feel it watching, waiting, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in my chest. Even after crawling into my sleeping bag and trying to convince myself to sleep, I couldn't. My mind was racing, every small noise outside the tent making my heart leap in terror. The wind rustled the trees, but I kept hearing something else. Something faint, like footsteps or breathing, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I stayed awake for hours, eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the small opening of my tent. I could still hear the faint whispers from earlier, but they were distant now, like they were moving away from the camp. Or maybe they were just playing tricks on me. My head swam in confusion and fear. What had happened earlier? Was I just imagining things? I forced myself to close my eyes, trying to block out the images of the whispers and the voice that had told me I shouldn't be here. But it didn't help. My mind was relentless. I started hearing strange noises inside the tent, scratching sounds, like something was moving across the fabric. I froze, not daring to move. It wasn't the wind this time. The sounds came again, and this time I could feel the tent shift, like someone was pushing against it. I couldn't breathe. My throat was tight, my pulse in my ears. "Sarah," I whispered, but my voice cracked. No answer. My breath caught in my throat. I looked to the side, but all I could see was the dark outline of the others' tents. They were silent. Too silent. I grabbed my flashlight, trembling hands flicking the switch on. The beam of light sliced through the dark, and I pointed it toward the entrance of the tent. The scratching stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned the flashlight slowly, heart hammering in my chest, until the light landed on the ground. My blood froze. There, on the ground outside my tent, were footprints. small, but distinct, fresh, wet tracks that led directly to the opening of my tent. And they were barefoot. They weren't from any of us. I scrambled back, my body hitting the wall of the tent, but the sound of my movements didn't seem to make any noise. It was like the air had thickened, muffling everything. The footprints, they led up to the tent, and then they just stopped. The ground around them was untouched, as if the person had just vanished. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't sit frozen in this tent, waiting for whatever it was to come back. I had to wake the others. But when I tried to call out again, my throat tightened, as if something was pressing down on me. My breath came out in shallow gasps. "Jason, Sarah, please," I croaked, but nothing. Not a sound. I felt paralyzed. I had to leave. I had to get help, but every instinct in me screamed to stay hidden, to not make a sound. The wind outside had picked up again, howling through the trees, but beneath that, I heard something else. It was faint, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Laughter. It was low and guttural, as if it was mocking me, like someone was standing right outside the tent, enjoying my fear. The laughter was joined by something else. A whisper, not in the wind this time, but directly at my ear. "Run." The voice was cold, sharp, and strangely familiar. I jerked away from the entrance, instinctively pressing my back against the corner of the tent. I could feel my heart beating in my throat now, my breathing ragged. And then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate steps, circling the campsite, getting closer, closer. It was no longer just one person. It was several. "Run," the voice repeated, this time louder, more forceful. "They'll come for you." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my heart slamming against my ribs, panic rushing through my veins. The flashlight was still clutched in my hand, the beam trembling as I pointed it toward the entrance. I didn't dare open the tent. I couldn't. I could hear them now, soft murmurs, like voices in the wind. It was like the island itself was alive, whispering to me, guiding me toward something I didn't want to find. My eyes darted toward the other tents. No movement. No sound. They had to be asleep, right? Or were they? Before I could finish that thought, the ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle, but enough to make me stumble. Someone was out there. I needed to get to the boat. I needed to leave. I had to get off this island before whatever it was, whatever they were, found me. I moved toward the zipper of the tent, almost crawling, trying to make no sound. But as I reached for it, something stopped me. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, pressing in on me. My hand hovered above the zipper, but I couldn't move it. I felt like I was being watched by something unseen, something that wasn't human. And then, right behind me, the whisper came again. "You can't leave." I spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, but there was no one there. My mind was unraveling, my thoughts slipping away. The sound of those footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling, was growing louder, and I could feel the presence of something cold, something ancient, closing in on me. The whispers returned, louder now, all around me. The voice that told me I couldn't leave was joined by others, all speaking at once. "You shouldn't have come here. It's too late. You'll never leave." I froze. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that they were right outside the tent, or that I had no idea what they were. But the terror was real. I wasn't imagining it. They were here, and they wouldn't let me go. I don't know how long I sat there, pressed against the wall of the tent, my breath shallow and quick, heart pounding in my ears. The laughter, the whispers, they didn't stop. In fact, they were growing louder. I couldn't make sense of the words anymore, but I could feel the meaning behind them. It was too late. I wasn't getting out of here. My mind raced through the options. I had to do something. I couldn't sit here any longer and wait for whatever it was to come for me. I knew there were only two places I could go, the boat or the woods. But the boat, it seemed like a lifetime away. I could almost hear the waves crashing against the shore, but the sound felt distant now, like it was someone else's nightmare. I couldn't run into the woods. If they were out there, the island itself might be in on whatever was happening. My only choice was the boat. I had to get to the boat. I reached for the zipper, forcing my hand to move, though it felt like my body wasn't quite my own. Every muscle was tense, every nerve on fire. With a shaking hand, I pulled the zipper open, the sound of it echoing in the still night air. The sudden rush of cold air hit me like a slap in the face. It was then that I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the dirt. They were here. Before I could even think, I scrambled out of the tent, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The world outside was cloaked in darkness, the faintest outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I spun around, scanning the campsite for any sign of movement. But it was too quiet. Too quiet. I crept forward, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. Every little sound sent my nerves into overdrive. A twig snapping, a rustling in the bushes. It was them. They were watching me. I felt eyes on my back, breathing down my neck. My feet moved faster than my mind could process. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just reacting, moving on pure instinct, desperate to get away. I pushed through the underbrush, my heart pounding, blood rushing in my ears. The path to the boat should have been clear, but now it seemed like the woods had grown thicker, darker. The trees seemed to close in around me, the branches reaching out like fingers, as if they were trying to trap me. Every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, pressing me into the earth. Something was wrong. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, my flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. It barely illuminated the path ahead, but I couldn't keep going without it. The whispers in the trees grew louder. I could hear them clearer now, the words more distinct. Run. You can't leave. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I spun around. I was sure I had heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, following me. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a sprint. Just get to the boat. Just get to the boat. But as I ran, the path seemed to twist and turn in on itself. The trees stretched up impossibly high, blocking the moonlight, and I lost all sense of direction. The boat was supposed to be straight ahead, but now nothing looked familiar. I stumbled. My foot caught on a root, sending me crashing to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, but my body felt like lead. The flashlight had fallen from my hand, and I could only hear my frantic breathing, the wind, and the footsteps. I froze. The footsteps were closer now. They were in front of me. A shadow passed through the corner of my eye, and I whipped my head toward it, heart in my throat. A figure that didn't belong. The moonlight reflected off something metallic, a flash of silver in the dark, but it was moving. It was coming toward me. I turned and ran, but my legs felt like they were made of cement. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could focus on was getting away, the sound of the footsteps behind me growing louder. Who was chasing me? What were they? Then, the whispers returned. They were all around me now, swirling in the air like an oppressive fog. I could hear them so clearly now. The words, their voices, they were no longer a distant echo. "You're not leaving." I crashed through the underbrush, barely avoiding the trees as they seemed to close in on me. The moonlight flickered through the branches, casting strange, warped shadows on the ground. My mind was spinning. I couldn't think straight. I needed to find the boat. But I couldn't. I was lost. I slowed to a stop, my chest heaving, my body trembling uncontrollably. The flashlight had gone out. I was alone in the dark, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the oppressive silence that followed me. Then, just as I thought my heart would explode from fear, I saw it, a shape in the darkness, just ahead of me. A person, a figure. My legs moved before my mind could comprehend. I stumbled forward, desperate for some kind of answer. But as I got closer, the figure moved. It wasn't a person at all. It was an illusion. And suddenly, I wasn't alone. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my throat burning as I gasped for air, each inhalation coming in ragged bursts. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs refused to move. They felt like they were glued to the ground. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The island, the boat, everything had become so distorted. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels in the darkness, and the whispers? They were no longer just distant murmurs. They were a constant, suffocating presence. They filled the air, slithering into my thoughts, making it impossible to focus. I took one step back, then another. The figure was still there. It wasn't moving. It was just standing in the shadows, watching me. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What was it? My flashlight, the only thing that had given me any sense of security, was gone, lost in the chaos. I was blind now, surrounded by a darkness that felt alive, suffocating. I could barely make out the outline of the trees, but nothing beyond that. The figure in the distance, it was still there. It hadn't come any closer, but it hadn't left either. Then I heard it. A voice. A whisper. Clearer this time, but so soft it felt like it was in my ear. "You don't belong here." The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. They curled inside my head, wrapping around my mind like a dark, suffocating fog. I froze. My legs turned to stone, and for a moment, I couldn't even think. I couldn't do anything. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees like a living thing. It carried something with it, something cold, something ancient. I could feel the temperature drop, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The whispers had changed. They weren't voices anymore. They were laughter. But it wasn't human. It was a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The laughter echoed around me, mocking, hungry. I looked frantically in every direction, hoping for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the oppressive, unnatural stillness that had swallowed the island whole. I wasn't alone. I knew it now. I could feel them, eyes on me. But not like before. It wasn't the feeling of being watched from a distance. This was different. It was as if something was crawling in the very air around me. Moving, shifting. It was closer than it had ever been. And then I saw it. A flash of movement in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but no, there was something there. A figure, pale and gaunt, emerging from the trees like a shadow made flesh. I tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in my throat, suffocated by the oppressive silence. I stumbled back, but the ground beneath my feet felt uneven, treacherous. My ankle twisted as I fell hard against the ground. And then the laughter stopped. Everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears. I lay there, staring up at the sky, at the stars that seemed too far away to reach, too distant for comfort. Then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming toward me. My breath hitched. I turned my head, eyes wide, searching for any sign of the figure in the darkness. I could barely see anything beyond the shadows, but the sound of footsteps, that was real. They were getting closer. And then, through the darkness, I saw it, the face. Pale, hollow eyes. The skin was drawn tight, like it was too small for the skull beneath. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was something else. I tried to move, tried to scramble away, but my body felt frozen. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. My limbs wouldn't obey me. I was trapped in the silence, in the cold, in the face of whatever this thing was. And then it spoke, its voice a raspy, guttural sound. "You shouldn't have come." I felt the words ripple through my body, each syllable cutting into me, deep inside me. I couldn't escape it. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me. I closed my eyes. I tried to scream. I tried to fight back. But I couldn't. And then everything went dark.